Hey, do you prefer to find the joy in life, or do you just want some help with that? If so, you're in the right place. So come on in and join the Joy Bunny clan. This is the My Slice of Life podcast. To be or not to be? That is the question. But a better question might be, who actually wrote it? Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the My Slice of Life podcast. My name is still Sharon and I am still your very own Highland host. That hasn't changed. What has changed though is the topic. And this week I am asking the question, would the real Shakespeare please stand up? Yeah, did William Shakespeare really write all those plays himself? And you might be wondering why I'm asking this, but apparently there are many people out there who do not think he is the author at all. So who is the real Shakespeare? That is the mystery we're going to unravel this week, friends. But before I get into all the mucky details, I'm here to remind you to like, follow, subscribe, comment, share, all that good stuff. There are also links in the description should you wish to check out my blog or really help me out and sub to my YouTube channel. And if that's not enough and you're thinking, Sharon, I'd like to give you a tip as a thank you for the hours of work you put into this, well, those options are also available in the description. But any way you can offer support would earn you my heartfelt gratitude. It really would. Remember though, to become a patron starts at only $2 a month, and there are behind the scenes kind of hanging out videos on there just for patrons to see. And buy me a coffee is £3 a month, or there's an option to tip any amount you fancy. But I'm sure you know what to do by now, so let's not make much ado about nothing and turn this episode into a tragedy. I couldn't help it. Let's crack on. It does seem there are a surprising number of people who question whether or not Shakespeare actually wrote all of the plays himself, or even if he existed at all. This was news to me. I was also surprised to find out this group are called, wait for it, Anti-Stratfordians. A bit of a mouthful. We've got quite a few well-known names among them though, such as Walt Whitman, Mark Twain, Charlie Chaplin, and Sir Derek Jacobi. He's a well-known British actor, at least he's well known in the UK, and he was actually in a movie called Anonymous, which was about this very topic, which I haven't seen yet, but I do intend to watch it very soon. So let's start with a little background on the man we know as William Shakespeare, and I got some of this on shakespeare.org, funnily enough. So, according to them, and many other people, William Shakespeare was born in Stratford-upon-Avon in England in April 1564. The exact date of his birth is not recorded, but it's thought to be the 23rd of April, which happens to be the same date we got our dog Scooby, but that's, maybe just a coincidence. Shakespeare's baptism, however, is recorded in the parish register at Holy Trinity Church in Stratford-upon-Avon on Wednesday the 26th of April, 1564. Now at that time baptisms were usually done within 3 days of a baby's birth, and the parents followed the rules of the prayer book, which said children were to be baptised no later than the first Sunday after birth. So folk have worked out this probably gives the date of the 23rd of April as his birth. He wasn't born into a well-off family really. His father was a glove maker. His mother came from a farming family, and it's believed that she stayed at home and brought up the children. But weirdly, Shakespeare also died on the 23rd of April in 1616 when he was 52 years of age. There isn't a lot of documentation about his life, which is what causes a lot of debate among the scholars. For starters, not much is known about Shakespeare's schooling. It's said he went to the town grammar school, although even this is argued about because there are no records of him attending there. Now, they don't exist because records just don't exist for that time period, but not just for him, for anyone who attended that school. So that's not that big a mystery. He married Anne Hathaway, not the actress you know, in November 1582 when he was 18 and she was 26 and already 3 months pregnant with her first child, Susanna. I know, the outrage. His wife came from a village near Stratford-upon-Avon called Shottery, and she was the daughter of Richard Hathaway, who was a local landowner. Now together, William and Anne had 3 children: Susanna in 1583, Hamnet with an N in 1585, and Judith in 1585 as well. Now tragically, Hamnet the boy, he died at the age of 11 during a plague outbreak in 1596. It's said Shakespeare was a businessman involved in buying and selling of properties and as a moneylender. He went to London in the late 1580s and became a shareholder in a theatre and an actor. Now, there are numerous business records in Stratford which prove his dealings there, so we know that part of his life is true at least. He went on to become a poet and the famous playwright we all know about today. Or did he? According to Alex McNeill, JD, who did a presentation where he put his case forward, brilliantly I have to say, to prove Shakespeare was not the author of the works with that name, stating that there are many flaws in the history. He starts by comparing Shakespeare with Dickens and asks, how do we know Dickens wrote his books? Because his life experiences are reflected in his work. He openly took credit for having written them. No one has ever suggested he was not the author, but according to Alex McNeill, the same cannot be said for Shakespeare. His life is not consistent with the author. What we know of his life is not reflected in the works. He never took credit for having written anything, and that is according to Alex McNeill, mind. And in 1593, it was the first time Shakespeare's name was in print, so it's been suggested by many that that's a pseudonym. Was the name William Shakespeare a front man because the real author couldn't come forward? McNeill continued by stating we're told Shakespeare worked from the 1580s to about 1611 and retired in 1612, passed away in 1616, then all his works were published in 1623. We're also told Shakespeare was an actor, but there's only one record of him receiving payment for theatrical performance, and that was in 1595. And I was thinking about that, and I thought, but maybe though, being a shareholder, he got his money from that, so he didn't need to be paid to act. Maybe he just loved doing it, Who knows? Now, despite buying property in London and all these other business dealings, there's no evidence of letters or other correspondence either to or from him. I admit I found this a bit strange. I mean, surely, right, with all the money lending, the buying and selling of property, being a shareholder in a theatre, you'd expect a lot of communication between business partners, wouldn't you? Even then, surely there would be something written down, letters and so on. By 1600, he was very wealthy and bought the second largest house in Stratford. Was that money from the buying and selling of property? Was it from the theatre? Was he just a loan shark? Because that's kind of how some of it sounded to me. In other words, what I'm asking is, where did all the money come from? I also found out a lot of people call him Shakespeare, using the short A and a short E, which they say the business records of the time showed was used more commonly, and the spelling then was so inconsistent in those days, it's more likely that's how it actually would have been pronounced. So not Shakespeare, he would have been Shakespeare. Right, so put all that aside for a minute, okay, and I just want to run through a few other thoughts from the anti-Stratfordians. The case they put forward is Shakespeare, we're told, is this amazing playwright, so why were his 2 daughters illiterate? Again, I was thinking about this and I thought, could it just be because girls didn't attend school like the boys did? And even those of middle-class families which did go to some form of formal education, they were often taught domestic skills, not academic ones. And I think that part of the discussion is often overlooked. Just, the things that I was looking at. They just say, oh, his 2 daughters were illiterate, how could that be possible? Well, girls just were taught domestic skills in those days, and that's what the focus was on. But there are other stranger things about Shakespeare which I don't have an answer for, so see what you make of these. Apparently in his 3-page will, there was no reference made to any books, manuscripts, or musical instruments. I found that strange. Apparently he left his second best bed to his wife. I just find that really odd. I find this weird too. His death, so they say, wasn't written about by fellow writers of the time, as was the norm. You'd think there'd be a whole lot of them writing some sort of epitaph or something, to Shakespeare, but apparently not. And in her book, called Shakespeare's Unorthodox Biography, Diana Price compared 24 literary contemporaries, that's not easy for me to say, using 10 criteria to connect them to a literary life of some sort. Now, the average score was 6 out of 10. Johnson scored a perfect 10. That's Ben Jonson from 1572 to 1637. He was a prominent playwright, poet and actor, and often regarded as the second most important English dramatist after William Shakespeare during the reign of James I. He was also a close friend of Shakespeare's. Another one, Christopher Marlowe, from 1564 to 1593. Yeah, he died young. He was 29 and was apparently stabbed during a bar fight. He was also a renowned English playwright, poet and translator of the time. He scored 4 out of 10. Shakespeare, on this scale, scored a big fat 0. Many found this weird since his career was longer than most on the list and he produced more works than a lot of them, yet he didn't score anything on this scale, which should have produced a connection to a literary life. The main question asked by many skeptics is simply, how could a man of such humble origins and education come to have such a range and depth of knowledge in topics such as law, medicine, English court life, royalty, and so on and so on? So many people argue that the true author must therefore have had a more extensive education and background than the man from Stratford is believed to have had. And so our mystery deepens. There are a lot of people who have been put forward as the real Shakespeare, but some feature a lot more than others. One of these people is Francis Bacon. Supporters claim Bacon had the necessary education and intellectual background. They argue that Bacon's philosophical writings and knowledge are evident in Shakespeare's works. Another name often put forward is Christopher Marlowe. Yet, as the author I mentioned earlier, I also mentioned he died in a bar fight. Well, many believe he faked his death and continued writing under Shakespeare's name. But there is one name which comes up a lot more than others, and that is Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford. And the people who support this theory are known as Oxfordians, and they argue that de Vere had the education, the literary talent, and courtly experience reflected in Shakespeare's works. They point to perceived similarities between de Vere's life and events in the plays. Additionally, the Oxfordian theory suggests that the later plays, get this, were written by others posing as Shakespeare after Oxford's death, because he died before all the plays came out. Now, there was a British schoolteacher by the name of J. Thomas Looney, unfortunate, who wrote a book in 1920 called Shakespeare Identified. He believed the author of all these works couldn't help showing his true identity in the works, so he drew up criteria for the author based on this theory. Now, he did 2 lists. The first list included being apparently eccentric, a recognised genius, and having a superior education, things like that. His second list includes things like being a member of the higher aristocracy, a man of feudal connections, and a follower of sports, especially falconry. He reasoned the author would have had previous works published, and the name he came to was indeed Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. Some of his poetry apparently had the same rhyme scheme as Shakespeare's first poem, Venus and Adonis, which was a 1200-line epic. 1200 lines as a first poem. In fact, when J. Thomas Looney researched de Vere's biography and compared it to the 18 qualities on his 2 lists, it matched all 18. First-class tutoring from a young age, a favourite of the Queen, and interestingly, awarded a grant of £1,000 a year by the Queen in 1586, and some believe that's payment for the plays he wrote. Also, there are many events through de Vere's life which show up in Shakespeare's plays, like his father dying when he was young, becoming a ward of the crown, and an arranged marriage, to name just a few. The play All's Well That Ends Well apparently has all that in it. I'll confess, I haven't read that one, so I'm going by the research that I've got. But De Vere was also well travelled. Apparently Shakespeare wasn't. De Vere went to France, Germany, Verona, Sicily, Venice, Genoa. Many of Shakespeare's plays are set in these places, and other similarities have been cited, such as being beset and stripped of his clothing by pirates, which happened in Hamlet. Some scholars also see echoes of Beowulf in the written works, but at that time the only known copy of it was apparently in the Cecil House, which just happens to be where De Vere lived after the death of his father. One point I did like was that his best friend and cousin was called Horace Vere. Guess what his nickname was? Horatio. Yeah, he knew him well. Now here's a story I have to tell you, right? There were two minor characters called Rosencrantz and Guildenstern in Hamlet, but get this. In 1583, De Vere's brother-in-law was sent to Denmark on a diplomatic mission, right? And he wrote letters about his time there, which were not published. But in them, he wrote about going to a state dinner where the guests included, you guessed it, a Mr. Rosencrantz and a Mr. Guildenstern. Another quick couple of things to note. At least 28 books were dedicated to De Vere during his lifetime, but Shakespeare? None. Apparently, as well, De Vere sponsored an acting troupe and is referred to as a playwright, although there are no plays with his name on them. Not one. I mean, I wasn't there at the time, I'm not quite that old, but from everything I'm reading, that seems to be the way it is. Okay, here's another one I really like. In 1578, someone called Gabriel Harvey addresses De Vere in Latin. Now, I don't speak Latin, so I'll do my best. He said, Voltus tila vibrat, which is to shake slightly and quickly, but some take it to mean, thy will shakes spears. What do you think? Is that one reaching a little bit, maybe? I wasn't sure, but I liked it. Now, Oxfordians also believe the plays were not written for the public, but for the Queen's court. I mean, the plays certainly show someone who knows royalty and aristocracy, but they don't really develop the more common characters all that much. So I found that interesting as well. It's all these little bits that I'm thinking, am I convinced yet? Anyway, we've gone through all those points. What about the Stratfordians? They were the anti-Stratfordians, now we come to the Stratfordians, those who believe Shakespeare did write them, no question, you're talking nonsense. Well, they say his name is on the plays and poems attributed to him, and apparently this is a big deal because at that time, not all plays would have had the author's name on them. They had usually the publisher's name and the name of the acting company that performed the play, but not always the author. Stratfordians then ask, why would a nobleman such as De Vere write a play and use a pseudonym when it wasn't common practice to put the author's name on them anyway? Good point. Now here's one I confess I didn't know. Maybe you do, I didn't know this. Several of Shakespeare's plays were collaborations, and this was well known, just me who didn't know. But this was actually common practice at the time, so nothing startling. William Shakespeare, say the Stratfordians, was well known at the time to be a writer. He was apparently referred to as an upstart crow by Robert Greene, but he had written praise in reviews in 1594 and 1595. So the Stratfordians were saying, look, here's written evidence. He wrote them, and they were reviewed at the time with his name clearly on it. As an actor and shareholder, Shakespeare is said to have written plays with specific actors and theatres in mind. He knew the acting troupe and the Globe Theatre well, so he wrote with all this in mind. He knew the size of the stage, he knew the characteristics of the actors, and that's what he was focusing on when he was writing the plays. The Stratfordians also point to historical records and documentation such as baptism, marriage, burial records, because, like I said earlier, some people said he didn't even exist in the first place. And then we come to the business and legal documents. They say there are numerous legal documents including property transactions, lawsuits and business dealings which link Shakespeare to Stratford and London, and they say this establishes his presence and financial activities in this location. Now it might prove he was in a certain place at a certain time, but does it prove he wrote the plays? Not so much. Another point made by Stratfordians is, they say, many writers and poets, including Johnson, mentioned Shakespeare by name and praised his work, indicating a recognition of his authorship. Now, one important point here that I do want to mention is the language and dialect used in the plays, because analysis of the language and dialect in Shakespeare's works, they align with the Midlands dialect of Stratford-upon-Avon at that time, which proves linguistic support for his authorship, or someone who was very familiar with the language and dialect of that area. Now, the grammar school education, again, while there's no direct evidence of Shakespeare's schooling, it's generally believed that he attended the King's New School in Stratford, where he would have received apparently a solid education in Latin and classical literature, which was typical for sons of prosperous citizens, if not the well-to-do and the upper class and all that kind of thing. Now, like the Oxfordians, the Stratfordians also draw evidence from the plays themselves, but this time in support of William Shakespeare being the author. The plays contain numerous references to Warwickshire, the county where Stratford-upon-Avon is located. These include special allusions to local flora, folklore and dialect, again, that suggest an intimate knowledge of the area. Would De Vere have had that knowledge? I don't know. I personally don't know. They also mention the point about legal terms and concepts, because they say the plays demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of legal terminology, which could have been acquired through Shakespeare's documented involvement in various legal disputes and his family's legal affairs. They point to plays like The Merchant of Venice, saying it displays an intricate knowledge of commerce and finance, aligning with Shakespeare's own experiences. That's true, but how does he know Venice? 13 of his plays were set in Italy or feature Italian locations. However, his biographers, they've found no credible evidence of him travelling to Italy. Just want to throw that in there. Now, the arguments go on and on. They've been going on for centuries, and if I'm honest, there are a lot more I probably could have gone into, but I've just tried to pick out the main points for this episode, or honestly, we'd be here for hours. But what do you think after hearing all that? I mean, I told you this one was a cracker, didn't I? I mean, I'll be honest, I'm really not sure about this one, because I think both sides have got pretty good points to make. And as someone who studied and loved Macbeth in high school, see the thought that I've been duped. That does not sit comfortably with me, I've got to be honest. I'm going to have to give this one a bit more thought. But as always, I mean, I'd love to hear what you think about this one. Was William Shakespeare really the author of all those plays and poems? Tell me your theories, because I'm getting a little stuck here. But don't panic, because you have a whole week to come to some sort of conclusion, because I'll be back next week with another mystery for us to solve, and it's a weird one. Let me tell you, I will say that. It is a weird one next week. So I really hope you'll come back and join me next week. But until then, you gorgeous little joy bunny that you are, you take care of your wee self.